Street Fighter Collection is a 1997 release for the Sony PlayStation comprising 3 classic Street Fighter games on 2 PlayStation discs. Super Street Fighter 2, The New Challenger, Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo, and Street Fighter Alpha 2 Gold, which is an upgrade of Street Fighter Alpha 2. Oddly enough, a follow-up compilation, appropriately titled Street Fighter Collection 2, would later see release, comprising the first 3 incarnations of Street Fighter 2. But that's a set of observations I'd rather not get into. For the uninitiated who have no remote clue as to what I'm talking about, here's a brief explanation of everything more or less. Street Fighter Collection is a 2-disc compilation for PlayStation, and also Saturn, but we're looking at PlayStation, comprising 3 games, and we'll go through each disc individually. The first disc contains both Super Street Fighter 2 The New Challengers and Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo The Ultimate Challenge. As one might surmise, both games are upgrades to the old Street Fighter 2 game. Super Street Fighter 2, the overall 4th iteration of Street Fighter 2, introduced 4 new characters, added a whole bunch of moves for the pre-existing 12 fighters, and completely overhauled the overall presentation with new musical remixes and visual upgrades brought about by a changing of arcade boards. Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo is more or less the same game, but with some further tweaks in addition to movesets, faster gameplay, a smarter AI, and a little thing called super combos that can be performed when you fill a little meter. It's these type of tweaks that are minor but really gives the game a different dynamic from its predecessor. It certainly says something about a game that's been played in tournaments years after its initial inception. With regards to this PlayStation version, you only have the bare bones minimum of game modes, the standard arcade and versus modes, applicable to both Super and Super Turbo iterations. Anyone hoping for the group battle or tournament modes of the 16-bit conversions will find nothing of the sort here. Control for the most part is fairly functional, even with the PlayStation D-pad thing. The graphics are almost kinda sorta arcade perfect with a somewhat faded color palette of sorts. It just looks really light in some regards. In regards to the soundtrack, you've only got the original CPS2 based arcade music, no remixes of any kind, but it plays pretty crisp for the most part, but has the annoying habit of looping music rather than streaming it straight out. As in, after a couple minutes the track fades out and restarts again much like a music CD, probably because the tracks play off the CD. Oops. Meanwhile, on the other disc, we have Street Fighter Alpha 2 Gold, a sizable update to Street Fighter Alpha 2 that tweaks the 18 fighters to certain degrees, with some bearing a new move or two and some getting some slight attribute tweaks or things of that nature. In addition, you can easily access alternate versions of specific characters by pressing start on some of these characters. Most of these pertain to fighters who have appeared in Street Fighter 2 and thus have an alternate version that plays similarly to how they would in that game. No super combos, no air blocking, a fairly bare bones moveset. Even then, a couple characters have an additional alternate type, such as your evil Ryus or classic Chun-Li or Shin Akumas. There's even a code in which you could play as Cammy as she appeared in X-Men vs Street Fighter, albeit only in versus modes. And while we're on the subject of modes, although still very much on the bare bones side of things, you do have a bit more than the usual arcade and versus modes on hand. There's a survival mode which gives you a chance to go through all 18 fighters in one endurance round, and Akuma mode which allows you to challenge Shin Akuma without going through any prerequisites to summon him like you would in arcade mode. No practice mode or dramatic modes of any kind to be found though, and the music tracks used are the remixed versions featured on the home versions of Alpha 2 rather than the original CPS2 based soundtrack, which I actually would have preferred, but these sound alright, so whatever. Although it's all essentially the same game underneath all the graphical window dressing, Street Fighter Collection does boast a fair share of variety in terms of its choices, showcasing the best version of Street Fighter 2 at the time, and its lesser but still fairly good predecessor, and perhaps the most definitive version of Street Fighter Alpha 2 on the PlayStation, which offers a lot more than what you'd get on the individual PS1 release, even if it was at the sacrifice of a couple extra modes. Both games run fairly smoothly for the most part, control is solid and responsive with virtually little to no lag in regards to executing special moves, super combos, and things of that nature. Gameplay works about as well as you'd expect it to if you're familiar with other iterations of Street Fighter, and the visuals are relatively crisp and smooth looking. There might be frames of animation missing and colors might seem a bit faded at times, most of the time at least, but they're not really missed all that much. Of course, there are some low points of note. When it comes to Street Fighter Collection, some occasional bits of slowdown will take place at times, the constantly looping music tracks that fade out before starting again because they play off the CD, and as such are prone to skipping, as you could no doubt make out in some cases in this video. Not much in terms of unlockable bonus material or anything of the sort, not that I really expected any, but it's something worth mentioning I suppose for those folks who care for that sort of thing. And of course, the sizable loading times that were commonplace with a lot of CD-based fighting games of this era and beyond. For what it's worth, Street Fighter Collection is a pretty solid offering of 3 quality ancient Street Fighters to game on your PlayStation 1 consoles. Certainly worth getting for the Super Street Fighter 2 games because they're still well-made, fun to play fighting games, but definitely worth getting for the Street Fighter Alpha 2 Gold update that offers more than the vanilla Street Fighter Alpha 2 release PlayStation owners got a year or so prior. That having been said, at least 2 of the 3 games featured here are offered elsewhere. You can get Street Fighter Alpha 2 Gold on the Street Fighter Alpha Anthology set for PlayStation 2, while Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo is featured on the Capcom Classics Collection Volume 2 for PlayStation 2 and Xbox. Not to mention you also have the HD remix from a few years ago on Xbox Live Arcade and PlayStation Network. As of this recording, the original arcade Super Street Fighter has yet to see re-release. But as far as Street Fighter Collection goes, it's a worthwhile addition to your PlayStation 1 collection if you're into Street Fighter and fighting games in general, and just all around good stuff.